is Rick Winslow. I'm the Barren Cougar biologist for the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, and today I'd like to talk to you about water and its importance to wildlife in the Southwest. So, the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish is in charge of wildlife management in the state of New Mexico, which basically means that we are charged with keeping good, viable populations of wildlife on the landscape for use by everybody, for people's enjoyment, for hunting and fishing purposes, because it's just natural and good to have wildlife on the landscape, and our world is better for having those wildlife species out there. And for us to be able to see them, I enjoy seeing creatures when I go out. I think most people do.
Hello, my name is Jeremy Lane. I'm a public information specialist with the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. I work out of the Southwest Regional Office in Las Cruces, and I'm part of a team that helps deliver the department's message to the public. We do that through outreach education and social media posts and presentations like you're about to see on wildlife management and conservation.
Okay, the first thing I want to show you is that conservation is not a new idea. Some people think that this came with some like new age, hippy dippy, green movement, earth-centric kind of focus. Not at all. This has been around for a very, very long time. As you can see on your screen there, people have found writings from the Mongol Empire talking about conservation and limiting game take over 700 years ago. These were in a ruler called Kublai Khan, if you've ever heard of him. And what they talk about in these writings is prohibiting the killing of deer and rabbits and large birds and other animals between certain months to allow those animals to reproduce. So what I want you to see there is even 700 years ago, people were thinking about how we can use wildlife resources wisely. So what is conservation? Conservation is the wise use of natural resources. That W word, wise, is the key one in that sentence. Wise use. We're going to use these resources, but we're going to do so wisely. We're going to make sure they stick around for generations to come. What are natural resources? A big part of natural resources are what we call renewable resources. Can anybody tell me an example of a renewable resource? All right, solar power, absolutely. Timber is another one. Trees for lumber, for the paper, for our books, for our houses. But one people don't think of very often is wildlife. Wildlife is a renewable resource. If managed correctly and used correctly, wildlife will replenish itself just like water, and we can use it. So preservation is sometimes thought of as the opposite of conservation. It's important that you know the difference between preservation and conservation. Conservation, again, is the wise use of those resources. We're going to use them. Preservation is hands-off. Simple way to remember that. But it's also another means of protecting and saving a resource. Sometimes it's necessary. It may not be our favorite thing because it does not include using that resource, but it doesn't have to be forever. Both are very needed in wildlife management. Okay, so when we talk about conservation and lessons that we've learned from wildlife management or mistakes that we've made, one of the most common stories is from the Kaibab Plateau in Arizona. Maybe you've been up there. It's in northwestern Arizona, and in the early 1900s, there were a lot of deer there. They wanted even more deer, though. They wanted their herd to do even better. So they thought, well, let's ban hunting to make the herd even bigger, right? Well, maybe you have an idea of how that went. They even took out predators so that fewer deer were taken. And the deer got overpopulated. They ate themselves out of house and home. They destroyed their own habitat because there were so many of them. And there was mass starvation. Starvation means to die without having enough food. So we learned from that. We learned that after they restarted hunting, today there's a healthy population there. So what we learned was that there's more to conservation than just protecting wildlife. You can't just simply say hands off and that's going to be good enough. So you saw what happened on the Kaibab Plateau. It's happening in the Northeast United States right now. We get too many deer, and that population needs to be thinned, needs to be managed, needs to be controlled. The goal of conservation, again, is to use and manage resources wisely. Okay, habitat. Habitat is made up of 4 components. Real easy to remember, 4 components. You've got to have food. You've got to have water. You need cover, which is a place to hide. And you have to have space between them adequate for that species. So let's say I'm a mule deer and I only move 25 miles in a day on average. Well, if my water source is 32 miles away, that's not good habitat. So the arrangement of them, the closer they are, is key. And different species need different size of space. Mountain lions need a ton of space to roam and to hunt. But those are your key, your habitat components there. Food, water, cover, and space. Okay, 4 things. The arrangement of these is vital. They can't be too close, too far, that kind of thing. Resources in a habitat can only support a certain quantity of wildlife. Like on the Kaibab Plateau, the deer got overpopulated and they ate all the habitat. So your habitat can only support a certain amount of animals. This changes. The amount it can support changes when it gets too hot and the plants dry out, there's not enough food. When there's drought, there's not enough water. Or maybe it's springtime when there's lots of plants to eat. The amount of the wildlife that the habitat can support is called carrying capacity. It carries the wildlife. So the amount of wildlife that the habitat can carry is called carrying capacity. We're gonna have a little activity with that later too. It varies from year to year. So if you estimate the carrying capacity for your ranch this year, it's not going to be the same necessarily next year. There could be a drought. There could be a very wet monsoon season there. Think of carrying capacity like this. So we have a bucket filling with water, but it's got a whole bunch of holes punched in it, right? The only thing bringing in more water, which represents the wildlife, is that hose, and that's annual reproduction. That's the wildlife reproducing and having baby wildlife. That's the only thing making more animals out there. We can't do it in a lab. So the things taken away from the population are things like weather, human development, they just get old and die, predators and hunting, starvation. So if we're managing correctly, wildlife is going to produce more than these natural causes and things like habitat loss take away. And that's why you see it overflowing over the top. That even with those holes taking away from the population, it's still overflowing from the top when we manage it correctly. So if habitat is so super important, then what can we do to improve habitat? We can do a lot of stuff. We know what that is, right? It's fire. A lot of times people think of fire as a very bad thing. And the Smokey the Bear campaign had a lot to do with that. But some ecosystems where the wildlife lives actually need fire. They have to have it to maintain that habitat. So we do what's called prescribed burning. We go out there and we do it under controlled conditions with firefighting equipment. In the short term, that picture on the lower left, after a fire, you get a moonscape. It looks, there's like the surface of the moon, right? Not very usable in the short term, but in the long term, you get that picture on the right. You get more open areas. You've killed the older trees. You've let younger trees grow in. You've also created a whole lot of grass. Things like that are super good for all species that live there, but particularly like elk. Elk love high altitude alpine meadows. So when you take that tree canopy out and let the grass grow, that's perfect for something like elk. Now, do just elk benefit from that? No. Everything that lives there benefits from it. The woodpeckers, the salamanders, everything. Here's another one. What's this guy? That's a deer at a drinker. He's getting a drink. That's something that we can do. So in my example earlier, I talked about, well, if we know how far mule deer are capable of moving on average, and their water sources, natural ones, are too far away, we can go out there and we can put in artificial drinking sources, can't we? We can improve that habitat by providing more water. There's some quail taking a drink and a big old elk taking a drink. We're going to talk about carrying capacity and habitat. This is my wife, Ariel. Everybody say hi, Ariel. Now, Ariel's got 4 limbs, just like you or I do. Habitat has 4 parts. Our 4 parts of our habitat are food, water, cover, and space. Food, water, cover, space. She's got 4 limbs, 4 parts to habitat. Now, our habitat has to support wildlife, and our tennis balls are gonna represent our wildlife. So hold out your arms there, and we need some. Let's see, we need elk and deer. We need turkey and quail. We need squirrels and chipmunks and lizards and birds and snakes. We need a lot of insects. They're at the bottom of the food chain. Oh no! Some of our wildlife is not able to be supported by the habitat. So our carrying capacity, the amount of animals that our habitat can support, has been reached. We can't support any more animals. That's carrying capacity. The amount of animals that our habitat can support is called carrying capacity. You might see that again, so remember it, okay? Now, carrying capacity is not the same every year. We talked about that. We're having a really good monsoon season right now, but what if we had a drought? So let's show that. I think this arm over here was water, right? We'll say it was. Okay, so let's say there's a drought. So go ahead and put that arm behind your back. Our carrying capacity went way down. A lot of animals were not able to be supported by our habitat. So do you get it? So she's got 4 limbs. Food, water, cover, space, that's your habitat. And the amount of stuff that our habitat can support is called carrying capacity.
Water is crucial everywhere, but particularly in desert portions of the world, and here in the Southwest in particular. Water is a very valuable resource, and it's somewhat scarce. It's important to all wildlife species. It's important to all our plants. It's important to us. And water is one of these resources that it comes to us from the sky. It comes to us from the ground. It comes from a number of different formats. It comes as rain. It comes as snow. Ice forms in the wintertime. which is water as well. But what's most important about it is that we have it. And the habitat that wildlife depends on is dependent upon wildlife. Habitat is all of those things that wildlife needs to survive. For instance, a bear. I'm a bear and cougar specialist. A bear needs food. The food is mostly from things that grow on plants, fruit, acorns, pinon nuts, juniper berries, and things like that. Those fruit species and those food species, the plants in general, depend on enough water in order to grow and to produce their fruit and to make their seeds and things like that that the bears eat every year. So water in general, particularly precipitation, which is rain or snow, it falls either during the winter in the form of snow or rain in the wintertime, but it's colder at that time of year and it soaks into the ground a little bit better. It doesn't evaporate and blow away in the wind as it does in the summertime, possibly when it's hot. In the summertime, we get about half of our water for the year actually falls during what we call the monsoon during the summertime, which is when we get all of the afternoon thunderstorms in the summer and all of that water falls down and runs mostly off, but some of it soaks in as well. When we get a good year where we have a very good monsoon, it's very good for the habitat. It creates a lot more fruit and nuts for the bears and the other animals. When the plants are adequately watered, when they get lots of water, they are more productive themselves. They're trying to make young, which is in the form of seeds, acorns, fruit, things like that, are how plants propagate themselves, how they make more plants. And when they have good conditions as far as moisture and appropriate soil conditions and appropriate heat and or cool for portions of the year, because plants need that portion of the year when it gets cold as well, they do better in general, and they can produce more of the fruit and the products that the wildlife need. The Taharis Watershed, which is the creek that runs in between the Sandia and Manzanita Mountains, it comes almost to Albuquerque and sort of runs from the East Mountains towards Albuquerque to the west, towards the Rio Grande. It no longer hits the Rio Grande, but it goes underground, and there's some groundwater that actually will make it all the way to the Rio Grande. But primarily, it is a surface running creek that is fed through a number of sources between the middle of the Sandia and the Manzanita Mountains, right along the I-40 corridor through Taharis and Carnuel and those areas. This is a really important area for wildlife in that particular area. The water that is there is some of the only free water that's available. Wildlife gets water through a number of sources. They get water from the food that they eat. They get water from the prey that they eat, in the case of predatory animals like mountain lions and foxes and things like that. But most of the water that they get is from drinking actual water. And that's important for a lot of species. There's some species that almost never drink water. There's some that need to drink water every single day. Animals get their water through a number of different routes. They get it through the food that they eat, and they get it from drinking water directly. The Taharis corridor and the creek that runs through it, and the springs that feed that creek, such as Carlito Spring and some of the other springs up in the Taharis area, are really important to all the wildlife that occur there locally. And additionally, along that corridor, there is a different sort of vegetation than you find in the upland portions of the mountains. There's all the riparian, which is a riparian area, is an area where there's a creek or some source of water and the different kinds of vegetation that live around it, whether those be cattails in something like a pond or a lake, or the willow trees and whatnot that grow along the creek along the Taharis corridor. Those areas are a slightly different kind of habitat that is really valuable to wildlife and to all the wildlife species along that area. Because water is so precious in the Southwest, any water source is important. The Taharis Creek is extremely important in that particular area. There's a lot of wildlife species that use that space and go up and down the creek to get water and to pass through from the Sandia Mountains to the Manzanita Mountains and to the Manzanos to the south. They go underneath the highway and they go through culverts and things like that in a number of places through there. So that's one part of that whole system that's important, is that those animals use that to not only get water but to travel to different places so that they can have the opportunity to spread out and to breed somewhere else other than where they were born. But the animals need that corridor and need the water that's in that corridor when they're moving from place to place. And also the vegetation that grows along the creek and along the Taharis Watershed is very productive for animals. There's green grasses all the time versus up in the upland areas where you might have grasses that are only green during the monsoon or after the snow melts. And so that can be really important to any of the wildlife that is eating those things. Deer, the rabbits, little smaller mice and rats and all these things. All of them are important because they're part of that whole system. The bigger animals in some cases eat the smaller animals, or the bigger animals utilize habitats that the smaller animals help to maintain, such as gophers turn over dirt. The dirt gets turned over, which allows aeration of the soil, which allows the soil to take in more moisture and more fertilizers from the air and from animal scat and things like that. And that actually helps the plants grow better in the future. One of the problems with an area like the Taharis corridor, right along I-40 and Route 66, is that because the wildlife are crossing back and forth, they are subject to getting hit on the roads by vehicles. And this is something we try really hard to avoid, and to try and fence the animals out of those areas so that they can't get onto the highway or onto Route 66 and then get killed by vehicle traffic. But another thing that happens in those areas, or in areas like the Taharis corridor and the Taharis watershed, is that you have a lot of people that are living in the middle of what is basically wildlands for the most part. The Sandia Mountains and the Manzanitas are on either side, and there's a narrow corridor that has homes and things like that, and then people live there. So the wildlife are naturally going through those areas because there's water and because it's a place that they can travel from one area to another, and they come into close contact with people. Unfortunately, that creates a problem sometimes. It's not a people problem. It's not a wildlife problem. It's the problem of both people and wildlife coming together. Sometimes it's not a problem. Birds love the habitat that we create by planting. The landscaping around our homes creates really excellent habitat for birds, and we feed the birds, and so they do really well. But when a bear comes into town, unfortunately, or comes into one of these areas, it is attracted by similar things to birds. That they eat bird feed as well, and they will tear apart a bird feeder. And then that makes people a little upset about the bear being there. And it's good for the bear in the sense that it gets a lot of calories from eating a couple pounds of bird seed, but it creates a problem because people are upset that the bear came and got into their yard and broke something, knocked over the garbage, made a mess, things like that. The bear gets some calories from this, it gets some food from this, but in the long run, it's not good because, unfortunately, people complain. They don't like to have these kind of things occur, and they call us and ask us to remove the bear. Most of the time, we will not remove the bear. What we would prefer to do is teach the people how to avoid having something like a bear come to their yard continually by not providing it with any attractants. We don't want people to have the garbage out the night before pickup because it's out there all night long, and bears and raccoons and skunks and foxes get into it and spread it all over the yard and spread it all over the neighborhood. The neighbors don't like this, the city doesn't like it, and it's a big mess and it creates a problem. So it's best to just avoid creating what we call an attractive nuisance.
Hello, my name is Stephanie Long, and I'm a member of the Sandia Mountain Bear Collaborative. The Bear Collaborative is a group of dedicated individuals working together with city, county, state, and federal organizations to study wildlife in the Sandia Mountains of New Mexico. The collaborative has a two-part mission statement. Number one, we conduct scientific wildlife research in the Sandias. Number two, we share our findings with the public and help to educate about how to protect and coexist with wildlife. This video has been created in conjunction with New Mexico Game and Fish, who is one of our partnering organizations. The video supports the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's 5-Star and Urban Waters Restoration Project via a grant awarded to Talking Talon's Youth Leadership, who's also one of our members. Thank you for joining us today for this educational wildlife experience.